My name is Ralph Nichols, and I'm very happy to introduce you to this course on effective listening. After spending some 30 years doing research in listening and the teaching of listening at the University of Minnesota, and during most of those years doing consultant work with business and industrial management across the country, I am just delighted to see the emergence of the present modes of training in this area. I think I'm accurate in saying that from this University of Minnesota base arose most of the formats and the methods for teaching listening that are now being used by those individuals presently involved with this kind of training. It's extremely important that we know how to listen to others, for this world of ours is getting so complex that we can't afford not to relate to each other. My deepest personal hope is that the counterpart of speech, listening, will receive increasing attention in the years ahead. Listening comprehension is just as important as reading comprehension. Quantitatively, it's more so. Of what use is any oral message which goes unreceived? To me, listening is the missing L in learning. Although the most used of the four communication skills of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, it is the least understood and the least taught of all four. So what you're about to do here is vitally important. It may be the most rewarding experience you will have, for you will find being an effective listener will make you more effective on your job, help you in your social relationships, make school more meaningful, and probably, most importantly, even help you at home. As you improve your listening, you will be much more productive. Lyman Stile and Telstar did a great job putting this course together. Dr. Stile and I worked together for over 10 years at the University of Minnesota. He succeeded me at the university. I know his work. It's good. Well, you're about to have a most enjoyable training session. Good luck to you.
As you know, we live in a communication-filled world. Daily we bombard others with and are bombarded by thousands of messages. Consider, for example, your daily dependence on newspapers, magazines, books, computer printouts, reports, memos, letters, speeches, newscasts, interviews, business meetings, the radio, audio cassettes, television, speech compressors, film, theater, and a myriad of other communication situations and methods which we deal with all the time. One thing is certain: we are communicating beings. Part of communication is listening. Although we can easily trace the flow of communication for 2,400 years, the concern for listening did not start until the early 1900s. As a field of study, listening is relatively young. In 1926, Dr. Paul Rankin undertook the first known investigation of how we spend our communication time. What percentage of your waking day do you think you spend involved in communicating with others? When Rankin asked that simple question from 1926 through 1929, the surprising fact was that people reported they averaged 70% of their total day engaged in communication. That's right. Over a collective period of 2 months, individuals who kept track discovered that they spent 7 out of every 10 minutes while awake communicating in some form or fashion. In addition, 8 major research efforts from 1926 through 1976 confirm Rankin's first conclusions. Every study clearly indicates that we spend an average of 70 to 90% of our waking time engaged in communication activities. More importantly, we generally spend our communication time in a very specific fashion. Let's focus on the primary methods of writing, reading, speaking, and listening. How do you spend your communication time? Take your pencil and paper and consider the following. Of the basic communication behaviors, writing, reading, speaking, and listening, which do you think is the most used? The second, the third, and the least used communication behavior? Do you have them down? Perhaps this will surprise you, but every study has indicated that writing is the least used, reading is the next least used, speaking is the next to most used, and listening is clearly the most used communication activity. More specifically, Paul Rankin discovered in more than 50 years of continued research on a wide variety of human subjects has confirmed that on an average, we spend 9% of our communication time writing, 16% of our communication time reading, 30% of our communication time speaking, and 45% of our communication time engaged in the act of listening. How do those percentages fit your communication behavior? It is almost certain that listening is your most often used communication activity. 50 years of research backs this up. We listen more than we do anything else. So let's look at the nature and extent of our training and effectiveness as listeners. Looking at our educational training, my former colleague at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Ralph Nichols, has aptly stated, our schools are upside down. That is, we spend the greatest amount of time in our schools teaching the communication activity we use the least, writing. And the second greatest amount of time is spent teaching the next least used communication activity, reading. The next amount of teaching time is given to teaching the second most used communication activity, speech. And the least amount of time, if any, is given to developing the most used communication behavior, listening. Our schools are upside down. Doesn't it seem to you that it should be the other way around? Schools should spend more time teaching and developing listening. It is certain that listening will be used the most for the rest of our lives. What was your educational experience? How about your friends, your colleagues, your children? Most of us have had little training in how to listen with skilled effectiveness. Although you probably have not been directly taught how to listen with skill, we do know that your listening attitudes and behaviors have been learned. Most often, however, your listening learning has been by happenstance. In spite of your limited direct training, you have learned to listen in the manner you now do. Listening is a learned behavior, and as it is learned, it can be improved. Research shows listeners are ineffective, and the need for improvement is critical. Over 30 years of research, begun by my predecessor, Ralph Nichols, and continued by me at the University of Minnesota, has clearly established that the average listener in our society is ineffective. You know, Hitler once said, "I know that one is able to win people far more by the spoken word than the written word, and that every great movement on this globe owes its rise to the great speakers and not to the great writers." Perhaps Hitler was aware of the general ineffectiveness of listeners. Our research at the University of Minnesota indicates that listeners operate at approximately the 25% effectiveness or efficiency level. For over 30 years, we have found that listeners listen to, receive, comprehend, and retain about 50% of what they hear if they are tested right away. Moreover, within 48 hours, the typical listener loses more ground and ultimately operates at approximately the 25% efficiency level. For example, in the last 48 hours, how effective have you been as a listener? To raise your level of consciousness and competencies, let's look at some examples and causes of communication breakdowns. Think for a moment of a breakdown of communication that you have experienced. It might have been a breakdown in your work experiences or your family experiences, your social experiences or your educational experiences. Can you identify an example of communication breakdown which resulted in significant cost? Some costs might include the cost of human time, the cost of money, the cost of human relationships, the cost of psychological pain, and of course, the cost of physical pain. Perhaps you can think of other costs that result from poor communication and listening. Examples of communication breakdowns resulting in extraordinary cost are all around us. So that you can sharpen your awareness of your view of yourself as a listener, how others view you as a listener, and your view of others as listeners, I want you to get your pencil and paper ready and answer the following questions. First, on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being the highest, how do you rate yourself as a listener? Go ahead, do it right now. Secondly, using the same scale, how would the following people rate you as a listener? Skip those that don't apply. Your boss, a colleague, a subordinate, perhaps your spouse, your children, your parents, a teacher, your best friend. How are those ratings similar? How are they different? And how do they compare with your self-rating? Now, let's complete the following statement. Blank is a skilled listener. Name a person that you see as a skilled listener and list 3 words that allow you to make that judgment. Next, let's complete the following. Blank is a poor listener. Again, list 3 words that support your judgment. And fifth, name a person who would describe you as a blank listener. Perhaps use 2 or 3 words that they would use in describing you. It could be your teacher, a friend, your boss, a subordinate, perhaps a family member, or your spouse. For example, they may identify your listening skills as skilled or biased, or interested, inattentive, or active, or critical, or emotional, etc. How would they describe you as a listener? Sixth and finally, use 3 words to describe yourself as a listener. Complete the following statement. I am a blank listener. How do you see yourself as a listener? What words are descriptive of your attitudes and your behavior? By now you have a clearer picture of your rating as a listener. You have clarified certain strengths and weaknesses that you exhibit as a listener. Moreover, you should have identified certain desirable and undesirable listening characteristics of others. Let's review 6 key points. So far, we've established 6 benchmark factors. We are communicating beings. Listening is central to our success. Listening is our primary communication activity. Although listening is a learned behavior, it is generally not taught. Listeners are generally ineffective and inefficient. And as listening is a learned behavior, it can, with focused attention, be improved. We identified that senders and receivers communicate for specific purposes or reasons in response to specific events and needs. Let's look at 4 basic but different purposes in human communication. It is critically important, our research shows, for listeners to be able to identify at any given time the sender's purpose. Often the sender's purpose and the listener's purpose of communication will be compatible, oftentimes not. Listeners, we find, need to be able to identify both the sender's purpose and their listening purpose of any given communication.
Hey, Preston, how's it going?
Hey, Bob, not too bad. Not bad at all.
Did you get any fishing in this weekend?
Oh, did I ever. You know, I expected to spend the whole day fishing, and I pulled out my limit in 30 minutes.
30 minutes? Did you have the kids with you?
Oh, yeah. You know I can't get out of the house without those guys. I mean, they were pulling in fish just as fast as I was.
Yeah, and I suppose your wife cleaned every one of them.
Well, she didn't do very many.
Phatic communication is the small talk of life and is often viewed by many as inconsequential, unimportant, and a waste of time. Phatic or small talk communication, however, allows the development of binding relationships, and binding relationships, we know, are central to all other communication purposes. As we develop our relationships, as we increase our binding together, our other communication purposes will be enhanced. If listeners view the small talk of life as unimportant, their involvement in the phatic purpose of communication will be diminished. As phatic communication is affected, we know the other purposes of communication will also be affected. A second purpose of human communication is labeled cathartic communication. The act of cathartic communication centers around the human need of psychological balance. Catharsis relates to the act of cleansing or purifying, and we see it's critically important. Catharsis is a communication act that allows the relieving of emotions. It is the act of venting or relieving, of dumping or unloading, dumping your bucket or getting the garbage out. And as psychiatrists tell us, the act of catharsis is critical to human mental health. And as we will see, cathartic communication is critical for all other purposes. Obviously, the listener's role is critical to allow catharsis or venting communication of the sender. Can you identify people who serve your cathartic needs? How important is their listening to your healthy venting? And whose cathartic needs are you serving as a listener? Are you aware when the primary purpose of communication is cathartic in nature? How skilled are you as a cathartic listener? These questions and other activities are in your study guide. Take time after this tape to go over them. The third purpose of communication is informational communication. Although we communicate information in all other purposes of communication, the specific purpose of informational communication is different from the others.
You know, Bob, I've been thinking, you're going to have a heck of a fight with your proposal to switch suppliers on the Orange project.
I know. Are you going to be able to help me out on this?
Yeah, I've got some information that I think it might be able to support you. First of all, you know, our old supplier has never done a building like this.
That really raised a flag in my department.
Yeah, well, second, they don't have the staff that this new supplier has. This new supplier has 4 structural engineers.
Good point.
You know, they put together some specs on this new building, and I'd like for us to go back to my office and let's take a look at them.
I'd like to do that.
Okay.
Essentially, the purpose of informational communication is to extend information between senders and receivers so that the receiver has shared information with the sender. The ultimate test is whether the sender and receiver have shared common information or ideas. The test of successful communication is not primarily the binding relationships or the venting communication of the sender and receiver. Rather, the test of success centers on the success of shared information. And again, keep in mind that this purpose, informational communication, flows from the others, phatic and cathartic. You start with the phatic to get through informational communication. We will examine your listening as it relates to informational communication throughout this series. Finally, there is persuasive communication.
Bob, I'm not sure that this is the best way to approach this.
What do you mean?
Well, let's look at it from the board's point of view. 2 of the board members were active in this company when the original supplier was first selected. That puts their decision on the line, so to speak.
I see what you mean. You're right.
If you can point out the differences in what the company was then, what the regulations were then, and what they are now, this will set the scene for a new decision to be made based on those new and different circumstances. This decision does not have to meet nor challenge their decisions.
You know, this is a new scene. You're right.
Bob, it's good to know that we're in agreement. Now, if you can supply them with the data that they need to make their new decision, I think you'll have it made.
In communication, which has the primary purpose of persuasion, we know that senders are basically attempting to do the following with receivers. First, senders attempt to reinforce the receiver's existing attitudes, their opinions, their beliefs, etc. Second, senders attempt to change the receiver's existing attitudes, opinions, feelings, etc. And third, senders attempt to affect the receiver's behaviors and actions. But we know one thing, and that is that behaviors and actions are changed ultimately by what is done at the attitudinal, emotion, feeling level. So let's ask one more important question, and that is, who is primarily responsible for successful communication, the sender of message or the receiver of message? And to define our terms, primarily responsible, I like to use the minimum level of 51% responsibility. In other words, who is primarily responsible at the minimum 51% responsibility level for successful communication, the sender or the receiver? My argument is not that the listener has more responsibility than the sender, or the sender than the listener, but rather that each of us as individuals have the primary responsibility, whether we are a sender or a receiver. As we change our roles, we must maintain the challenge of responsibility, and of course, never less than 51%. If you will accept and practice this, it will positively affect your communication behavior, and especially your listening behavior. At any given moment in our communication experiences, we will each play the specific and primary role of a sender or a receiver. If you picture your constant interchange of the sender-receiver roles as an interchange of 2 hats, a sender hat, the receiver hat, the sender hat, the receiver hat, etc., I argue that you need to assume the 51% minimum responsibility at all times. And this responsibility will provide a foundation for each of the other hats and will serve you well. Assumption of the primary responsibility for successful communication, regardless of our communication role, will move us from passivity through responsibility to activity. From passivity through responsibility to activity. And that will change our listening behavior.
You know, what really intrigues me about listening is that you can examine what's going on while people listen. Now, I know that listening is important, and poor listening can be very expensive. But can you give us more? Can you give us a set of guidelines or a formula that would help us in the future? Is there some kind of a tool?
First of all, let me define listening and then show you a formula that I've developed to examine the listening process. Listening can be defined as the complex process of, first of all, receiving or sensing a message. Secondly, understanding or interpreting the message. Thirdly, judging or evaluating the message. And finally, responding or reacting to the message.
That sounds like a complex definition.
Perhaps, but we're talking about a most complex human act. However, we can simplify the definition by mastering a simple formula. I call this the SIER formula. First of all, do you get the message? Second, do you understand the message? Third, do you agree with the message? And fourth, how do you respond to the message? I put that into a formula that I call the SIER formula. And if you can picture in your mind's eye a triangle with 4 floors to it, kind of like an A-frame house. Each floor will represent a part of the formula. I'd like to show you this tool. You'll have to improve your listening behavior, and the 4 letters again are SIER. To help you remember those, I want you to simply think about the words success in everyday relationships. And you can use this formula in different time frames. I'll explain that later. You know, when you build a house, once you get that loan and the plans and all the other things put together, the most important thing is building the foundation. And in many ways, when we start talking about listening, the most important part of listening is the foundation. Secondly, of course, the foundation can be as strong as possible, but if the first floor of the house is faulty, we know that the rest of the house will also be faulty. And much is true with listening. If the first floor is faulty, regardless of how well the foundation is built, the rest of the process of listening will also be faulty. And so it goes all the way up. We know that there are 4 components of listening. Each of these components is necessary but not sufficient in and of itself. The most important component is that foundation. If the foundation of listening is faulty, all the rest of the listening process will also be faulty. Jerry, let's take a look at the model that I call SIER. This is the bottom block, and it's the block that I call sensing. It's the bottom line, the baseline for the rest of our listening communication pyramid. If we have failure in listening at the bottom line, it's clearly predictable that we'll have a breakdown in all the higher, more complex levels of listening. Sensing is nothing more than the assurance that the message gets into the stream of consciousness of the listener. So when somebody sends a message to you or to me or to others, the most critical thing that we need to deal with is, do we pay attention to it? Do we hear it? Do we sense it? Do we get it? And I can tell you with no reservation at all that a lot of listening problems simply grow out of the fact that the listener is not productive at the sensing levels. Let's go to the next level. In the I level, all we're talking about in the process of listening is the interpretation, or how do you interpret the message? Do the words of the sender and the words as received by the receiver have relatively comparable meaning? In other words, do we get a match-up with the meaning of the sender and of the receiver? All we're talking about interpretation is this. Do the words I share with you mean the same thing to you as they do to me? In the third level of listening, we're talking about E, which stands for evaluation. We're not asking at this stage, do you hear me? Or do you understand me? But now we're asking, do you agree with me? Do you accept what I have to say, or do you reject it? Do you like it, or do you not like it? Do you agree, or do you disagree? In other words, what is the judgment that you make based upon what you have heard and understand? This third level is an area that pertains to the 4 different purposes of communication that we talked about earlier in a somewhat different way. Remember, phatic or small talk communication, cathartic or unloading or venting communication, informative communication, or persuasive communication. When we talk about phatic and/or cathartic communication, judgment or evaluation is not called for. But when we talk about informational or persuasive communication, we believe that judgment is very much a part of the listening process. And I know that a lot of what is called listening failure and communication breakdown occurs only because people disagree with one another. We're going to spend more time with the evaluation factor later. Fourth is the roof of the house of communication. And here we're talking about reaction. Even though you're successful at the S level and the I level and the E level, you're not home free yet as a listener. We still need to talk about the level of reacting. How do listeners react to the message that they hear, understand, and agree with? Remember one thing about this act of listening. We will never know to what extent a person has sensed, interpreted, and/or evaluated the message until they react. I think that you'll agree that a complete listener is a reacting listener. And yet we know that many listeners do not fulfill their 51% minimum responsibility because they don't react to what they hear. As I oftentimes tell listeners, I will interpret your reactions any way that I want, so that it's up to you to react the way you really feel. But many listeners, strangely enough, don't react. All we're talking about here is what kind of visible action you have after you have sensed, after you have interpreted, and after you have evaluated the message. Let me summarize the four-block concept of our listening house by saying that here is a four-part formula that fits the definition or description of the act of listening. Sensing alone is not listening. Interpretation alone is not listening. Evaluation alone is not listening. And reaction alone is not listening. But putting all of these elements together, you have the total act of listening. And remember, each level is necessary, and until fulfilled, we have a problem. But each level fulfilled in and of itself is not sufficient for the total act of listening. Now, you can use this formula, Jerry, in one of three ways. If you can think about a past tense breakdown of communication where there was a problem of listening, you can use SIER as a diagnostic tool. You can use it to determine what was the lowest level at which listening failed. And what I suggest is that you always go to the lowest level. You go to the sensing level first and ask some questions. Be careful now, because if you ask the wrong questions, you're in trouble. Don't ask, "Did you hear me?" Because people oftentimes lie and say, "Yes, I heard you." Rather, ask, "What did you hear?" Or we need to ask ourselves, "Did I hear the message in its entirety?" Go back and find out at what level the breakdown occurred. Secondly, we can use SIER in the present tense, the right here, the right now point of time. And finally, thirdly, we can use SIER as a tool in the future tense. We can use it as a planning tool. If you can think of communications that you're going to be involved in later on, this morning, this afternoon, tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month, you can use this tool as a planning device. And here's the way to do it. We make sure that as listeners, we sense in relative entirety, that we understand in a way that is relatively comparable to the sender's message or intent. Thirdly, that we make judgments that hopefully are matched up with the sender's judgments or purpose. And finally, that we react accordingly. Let's test your listening ability. I challenge you to listen to the following exercise like you have never listened before. This is a short exercise. It consists of just 4 sentences and lasts about 40 seconds. At its conclusion, you will be asked 10 questions. Remember, I challenge you to listen as well as you have ever listened. Don't take any notes. Are you ready? Here we go.
Please have your Mr. Gill pick up Mr. McGrew of Amalgamated Products at the airport at 8:30 a.m. Mr. Gossett was to have gone, but he's sick and can't make it. Bring Mr. McGrew to our offices at 714 18th Street, as there will be an important meeting at 10 a.m. At the conclusion of this meeting, Mr. McGrew may advise his boss, Stanley Gross, to buy our company.
Well, how did you do? Did you listen as well as you could? Or did you suffer from any interferences? Were you distracted? Turn to your study guide now, and I'm going to ask you 10 questions. And you'll have 4 choices for each question listed in your study guide. Select the best answer based on the information you've just heard. Here we go. Question number 1, name the man sent to meet someone at the airport. Number 2, name the man being met at the airport. Number 3, where are the offices of Amalgamated Products located? Number 4, best describe the time allowed to bring the visitor to the company office. Number 5, who was the highest ranking person referred to? Number 6, what is your best inference about the size of the 2 companies? Number 7, what do we know about the receiver of this message? Number 8, how does the speaker feel about the possible sale of his company? Number 9, who is apparently trying to impress whom? And finally, number 10, who was the person unavailable because of illness? Now let's look these over. Which ones do you feel you got right? Check those that you think you got right. And circle those you think you missed for sure. Go ahead and take your time. If you think you missed any, why? Identify any interferences that you think adversely affected your listening success. Now that you have tested your listening, let's listen once more to the message, and then we'll look at the correct answers.
Please have your Mr. Gill pick up Mr. McGrew of Amalgamated Products at the airport at 8:30 a.m. Mr. Gossett was to have gone, but he's sick and can't make it. Bring Mr. McGrew to our offices at 714 18th Street, as there will be an important meeting at 10 a.m. At the conclusion of this meeting, Mr. McGrew may advise his boss, Stanley Gross, to buy our company.
Well, let's look at how you did. The answer to question number 1 name the man sent to meet someone at the airport, is C, Mr. Gill. The answer to number 2, name the man being met at the airport, is B, Mr. McGrew. The answer to question number 3, where are the offices of Amalgamated Products located, is D, no information given. We'll come back to that one. The answer to question number 4, best describe the time allowed to bring the visitor to the company office, is C, no sensible answer to this question can be made. Number 5, who was the highest ranking person referred to? The correct answer is D, no sensible answer to this question can be made. Number 6, what is your best inference about the size of the two companies? The best answer is D, no dependable hints on this item were given. Question number 7, what do we know about the receiver of this message? The best answer is D, based on the information. The question cannot be answered with information supplied. Number 8, how does the speaker feel about the possible sale of his company? We believe the best answer is C, we cannot determine his attitude on this issue. Number 9, who is apparently trying to impress whom? Best answer, A, the speaker is apparently trying to impress the receiver. And finally, number 10, who is the person unavailable because of illness? The best answer, Mr. A, Mr. Gossett. Well, how did you do? Quickly check your actual score and compare the items you thought you missed with the items you actually missed. To what extent were you accurate? If we apply the SIER concept to what you have just experienced, these exercises will be more profitable. If you missed question 1, 2, and 10, and possibly number 3 and 4, your listening was probably interfered with in some way. These questions require the thorough sensing of the data, the correct interpretation of the data, and the remembering of data for later reaction. If missed, questions 3 through 9 are usually missed because the listener infers certain things and makes evaluation of the data. I call this inferential evaluation. Let's look more closely at what happened here. First, remember that this was a very short message with a limited amount of concrete data. Second, you were challenged to listen like you had never listened before. Perhaps this helps prove we cannot just will ourselves to listen well. We must exercise our listening muscles to develop our ear cue. Third, your listening may be adversely affected by forces of interference. Let me make a critical point about controlling interferences in listening, and then outline the nature of interferences that we know work against listeners. As listeners, you live in a world filled with interfering forces, and these interferences will destroy your listening unless, first of all, you become aware of what interferes with your listening, and second, you become skilled in combating the interfering forces. Interferences are either external or internal in nature, or a combination of external-internal forces. Both are largely impacted by your 51% responsibility commitment. External interferences are all around us and include such distractions as noise, interruptions, the dialect, physical appearance, mannerisms, or vocabulary of the speaker, the physical environment, data overload, and so on. Internal interferences are primarily impacted by your mental and physiological set. Such factors as your interest, attention, attitudes, knowledge, daydreaming, commitment, whether you're hungry or overfed, rested or tired, and so on, impact directly on your listening. But most importantly, you can overcome these kinds of distracting interferences, and let me show you how. Now let's go back and analyze your listening actions as you listened to this last exercise. If you missed the items of immediate recall, was it due to a distraction? Look at question number 1. You shouldn't have had trouble with that one, for it was the first bit of information given. If you heard it, sensing, correctly understood it, interpretation, and filed it for possible retrieval reaction, you should have been successful. If not, you were probably interfered with. Perhaps you weren't ready at the outset. Perhaps you felt inundated with too much data. Perhaps you were interrupted. Perhaps you weren't committed, didn't really care, or 100 other reasons related to listening interferences. How about question number 2, 3, 4, and 10? Many people say, well, I missed those because I just gave up. I threw in the towel when I heard all those names, numbers, dates, times, and places. I knew I could never get all that, so I gave up. Now that's a self-induced internal interference. If you say, I can't handle all this stuff, the consequence is that you won't listen to any of it. You're interfered with at the sensing level and have predictable problems. Let's draw an analogy of listening and fish going downstream. If you miss the first fish, forget it, because it's probably gone. But if you ponder what was missed, I predict you're being interfered with and will likely miss the next fish or bit of information. Come back later and deal with what you missed. Don't let that become another factor of interference. If you missed question number 3, you probably erred with your inferential evaluation of data. In question number 3, you may have heard the address 714 18th Street and inferred that that was the address of Amalgamated Products. Actually, the address of Amalgamated Products was never given. The same with question number 4. You might have heard the times 8:30 a.m. and 10 a.m. and made a judgment based upon your inference that there was a given amount of time to get from the airport to the meeting. But if you missed number 4, a possible problem is we don't know the respective locations and distance between the airport and the office. You may have missed these judgmental questions because you were interfered with at the SI or R level also. There are simple things that you can do to combat the internal and or external interferences. First, prepare and commit yourself to listen actively. As successful listeners tell us, it is a matter of psyching up both the psychological and physical level. Second, identify the potential forces of interference in every listening situation that you face. An exercise in the study guide will help you here. Third, actively move to reduce those interferences. Fourth, plan to report. Plan to report the general essence of what you are listening to another person later on in the day. Thousands have reported to me that the plan to report action pays dividends. It really works. The commitment that you make to report to another real, live, warm-bodied person later on in the day will force a change in your behavior. Simply put, you cannot report what you didn't listen to in the first place. We all face 3 universal problems. First, we can listen faster than the average speaker speaks. Second, we often don't use that time difference productively. And third, we usually don't take effective mental or written notes. The poor listener suffers in all 3 counts. Fortunately, there is a solution. You can improve your listening skill by listening for the organizational arrangement patterns of the speaker. Simply put, poor listeners do not use their thought-speech speed time advantage. They waste their time off on counterproductive daydreams or mental tangents. They listen primarily for facts. Poor listeners do not take notes, mental or written. They do not listen for the central idea of the message. They do not listen for or adapt their listening to the speaker's organizational pattern. And poor listeners do not anticipate the organizational pattern related to the speaker's habits or the speaker's topic. Good listeners are different. As they plan to report what they hear later, they look first for the central idea and organizational pattern of the speaker. Second, they use their thought speed, speech speed differential to their advantage. Third, they don't waste time daydreaming. And fourth, they take notes that are adapted to the organizational pattern of the speaker. Remember, any speaker you will ever listen to will fall someplace on a continuum of being organized or unorganized. Whatever the speaker's purpose, emphatic, cathartic, informative, or persuasive, whatever the speaker's situation, whether the speaker is formal or informal, whether the speaker is prepared or unprepared, whether the speaker is communicating one-to-one or one-to-many, we know that speakers generally fall on an organizational continuum from organized to unorganized. Make the speaker's organizational habits and behavior work for you. To do that, you need to identify, is the speaker organized or not? And if organized, how? If not organized, how can you organize the unorganized speaker? Fortunately, there are some guidelines that will help. The key is that you must adapt your listening to the speaker's organizational pattern. This is one way you can use the advantage of your thought speed, which is faster than the speaker's speech speed. The critical point is this. If organized, speakers use a limited number of organizational patterns. If you adapt your listening to the speaker's organizational pattern, you will gain an advantage. Simply put, you will have a clearer picture of what is said. You will see the structure, the skeleton, and you will have an organizational pattern to attach the factual data to. If the speaker is unorganized, you can still use these same limited arrangement patterns to organize the unorganized information. You need to identify the organizational cue language that speakers use. Speakers often choose to organize their ideas climactically or anticlimactically. Let's look at these two structures. The climactic builds to the final conclusion. In the anticlimactic pattern, we know the speaker's conclusion at the very onset. Many speakers arrange their material in a general to specific fashion. Such arrangement usually leads to a climactic ending, and we don't know the speaker's conclusion until the end. Here's an example.
It's a pleasure to warn you of the thief of life. This thief shortens your breath. This thief befouls your nest. This thief diminishes your savings. This thief reduces your friends. This thief ruins your clothing. This thief blackens your lungs. This thief steals your life. Without question, smoking is harmful to your health, finances, relationships, and longevity. Smoking is indeed a thief of life.
Consider what was just said. Was this speaker organized? And if so, how? Yes, you should see she was organized, climactically organized. She moved from general data to a specific conclusion. Whether we ultimately accept or reject her conclusion, our general tendency is to get caught up in her climactic development. Like in the mystery story, we are often snared. We stay to the end to find out who done it, or what is her point. When you recognize the climactic speaker, moving from the general to the specific, as the example, you need to listen to the general data, as it will be the support for the specific conclusion drawn. Now let's look at the same message, developed anticlimactically. Remember, in the anticlimactic, we know the speaker's conclusion at the very outset. Had this speaker organized from the specific to the general, she could have said,
Smoking is a thief of life. Smoking is harmful to your health, your finances, your personal relationships, and your longevity. Smoking is indeed a thief, and I've got proof. Smoking shortens your breath. Smoking befouls your nest. Smoking costs you money. It ruins your clothing. It costs you friends. It blackens your lungs. It steals your life.
The anticlimactic structure might have affected your listening in a number of ways. If you agreed with the speaker's initial point that smoking is a thief of life, you may have relaxed your listening to support data that followed, and you may have missed something important. On the other hand, if you disagreed with the speaker's initial point, you probably became defensive and may not have listened to the supporting data. Or you may have become supercritical of the support data and were too busy building your case and missed the speaker's point. In summary, The anticlimactic structure generally does not hold your attention like the climactic structure. When you note the different structures being used, double-check the effect on your listening. Withhold your judgment, listen to the entire message, note the structure, and plan to report. Now let's look at 4 organizational patterns that you will hear quite often. Any of them can be used in combination with the climactic or anticlimactic structure. First of these patterns is enumeration. Speakers build their organization around a given number of points. This is one of the most common arrangement patterns that speakers use.
I'm happy you could join me this morning to discuss our fundraising task. Now, there are 4 points we need to cover. First is setting our goal. We need to establish a realistic figure and divide it into each department's needs. Second, we need to identify our potential population. Third, outline our strategy. Fourth, setting completion dates for each strategy. Now, we can go into all of it in detail while we have some coffee.
The enumeration pattern is usually clear, and the numerical cue language of first, second, third, etc. will help you. If you adapt to the speaker's structure, you will end up with substantially more information. However, there are some limitations. Although apparently simple in nature, enumeration poses some pitfalls to the listener. The primary pitfall is that enumeration is most often used in expository communication. Exposition is usually informative. People explain things, and pure explanation is oftentimes overloaded with data, which may be boring and sleep-inducing. When you hear a speaker outline more than 3 or 4 points, take written notes, adapt to the numerical structure, and your listening will be improved. A second organizational pattern speakers use is the problem-solution structure. Speakers may simply introduce a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, we face a grievous problem. We are the only major city in the entire state that does not have fluoridated water, and this problem has been recognized by the Dental Association.
Or the speaker may primarily develop the cause of a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, for months we have recognized the problem of our non-fluoridated water supply. Tonight, I want to discuss the cause of our problem. As you well know, our city engineer and city council have taken a definite position against fluoridation.
Or the speaker may primarily develop the effect of a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, we must examine the effect of this fluoridation problem on our youthful population. The primary effect of our non-fluoridated water will show up in our children's teeth. The effect will be increased cavities and increased dental bills.
Or the speaker may primarily develop the solution of a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, the solution is complex but necessary. If we are to reduce this problem, we must obtain the support of the majority of the community.
As we listen to speakers, we will hear the use of the problem development, or the cause development, or the effect development, or the solution development. Speakers will organize around any single component of the problem, cause, effect, solution arrangement pattern, or around any combination of the 4 components. The key to improving your listening is to listen for the problem, cause, solution cue language, and to then adapt your listening to the speaker's organization. As you build on the structural skeleton, you will end up with more support data. Third, speakers often structure their ideas around a time sequence pattern. That is, they trace a chronology of the past, present, future, or yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
If you analyze the widespread use of drugs in our society, you'll see a clear-cut change over the years. Historically, we can track the relative non-use by young persons of any drugs in the United States up to the mid-1960s. Without question, the widespread use of illegal drugs was non-existent until the Beat generation of the 50s and 60s. But the generation gap, the Vietnam War, and the political reaction of the mid-1960s corresponds with the widespread use of numerous drugs. And this growth continued into the mid-1970s. And we can see an interesting trend. In the 70s, a general decline of widespread use of illegal drugs is noted, and as we look to the future, experts are predicting further change.
What have we just heard? In this case, the speaker built his message around a time sequence pattern. And as the time frame is developed, you have a discernible pattern to adapt to. Your listening improves as you organize and adjust to the speaker's organizational pattern. Listen for the cue words that suggest a structure of time. Whether formal or informal, and regardless of the communication purpose, many topics and communication purposes dictate the use of time sequence. A fourth arrangement pattern speakers use is the spatial or pictorial pattern. Simply put, speakers draw a picture for our listening ear. Consider this.
You know, I heard an interesting speaker at our executive meeting, a Mr. Strand, a renowned financial investment expert who explained what it takes to be financially successful in this country today. He said we should picture in our mind's eye a ladder of financial success, and that if we want to be financially successful, we have to climb 4 rungs on this ladder. Now, the first rung he talked about was a solid, thorough, and liberal education. Education is critical because it lays a foundation for all future decisions. The second rung he talked about was contacts. Our contacts of the family we were born into, the people we went to school with, the people we work with, live with, socialize with, all have an important impact on our financial success. The third rung was our long-term motivation. He claimed that every study of financially successful people showed high motivation was central to their success. And finally, the fourth rung on his ladder of success was a master plan. This master plan was the most important of all. You know, as long as I see the picture of Mr. Strand's ladder of success with its 4 rungs, I can easily remember his key points. I carried more information out of that presentation than any I can remember.
What have we seen here? The speaker obviously drew a picture and used a graphic pattern in organizing what was said to this listener. And this listener profited from that structure. If you can detect the picture and organize your listening around it, you'll get more of the message. The main advantage is that you will combine your sense of sight, even if imagined, with sound, and will be more clearly perceptive of the skeleton to hang the facts onto. And as you just saw, some speakers will combine their organizational patterns. The spatial pattern may be the primary structure with the supplemental use of another pattern. As in these latter cases, you saw the secondary use of enumeration. Spatial arrangement patterns require special creativity from the speaker. But when you detect this pattern, it will serve you very well. The speaker's cue language, again, is important. Speakers generally indicate their use of spatial arrangement by such language cues as, I want you to picture in your mind's eye, or imagine, or visualize if you can, etc. Remember, the speaker's cue language will point the way. There are other organizational arrangement patterns that speakers use. Watch for them. That means you're becoming a student of speakers' structural patterns. Don't forget, some speakers will be highly organized to highly unorganized. If organized, speakers will utilize one arrangement pattern as the primary pattern and sometimes others as a secondary pattern. By listening for and using these patterns of arrangements, you will overcome the universal problems of the poor listener: wasting the speech-thought-speed differential, poor note-taking, and listening primarily for facts. If the speaker is organized, listen for the central ideas, thus developing a skeleton to attach the facts to. You will use your listening time actively and productively. You will reduce the distractions of mental tangents. You will adapt to any speaker, and you will listen better. On the other hand, if the speaker is unorganized, your listening can still be aided. First, you will recognize the lack of organization. Second, you can use any of the 4 arrangement patterns and organize the unorganized into your own system. You will use your time actively and productively and be a better listener. To summarize, organizational arrangement patterns have been used by speakers for their benefit for thousands of years. Now, you can develop your skill of listening for patterns for your benefit.